Hello and welcome to the Kyoto Conference on Arts, Media and Culture and the Asian Conference on Media, Communication and Film. My name is Apipol Seitang from the International Academic Forum, and having with me here today is Professor Jeffry Gayman from Hokkaido University. Professor, would you introduce yourself for us, please?
So I am Jeff Gayman of Hokkaido University School of Education and also the Research Faculty of Media and Communication.
Today you gave a keynote presentation titled The Meaning and Message of Indigenous and Fourth Media, with a focus on media created by the Ainu. So now you talked about fourth media, or so-called fourth cinema. So could you briefly walk us through what is it, fourth media, what is it, who made it, and what's it for?
Right. So I should provide a caveat at the beginning that I'm not a specialist on media per se, and so that was the reason for a mistake in my title. It should have been fourth cinema, which refers to cinema which is produced by indigenous peoples themselves.
And that would be the indigenous people themselves producing to what, as in communicating within their indigenous communities, or is it a way to sort of express themselves to the outer, so-called outer world, other than the indigenous groups themselves?
It can be both. So, for example, these days, one method of indigenous language revitalization is for indigenous people to use mobile phones to interview indigenous elders who speak indigenous languages or who are culture bearers with specialized cultural knowledge. And in these cases, the audience is meant to be other members of the indigenous group. So I guess you could say that this is a kind of cultural arm of the indigenous media movement. And there is also a political arm as well, which is geared towards broadcasting the marginalized conditions of indigenous peoples within the globe.
Now, for indigenous advocacy, what's the role of digital media?
Speaking of other indigenous peoples, I believe that there is probably much more of a grassroots, produced grassroots, edited indigenous advocacy, which is appearing on the internet for global audiences. Right. In the Ainu case, the Ainu people with whom I work here in Japan, we are looking at more of a phenomenon right now of things related to language or culture only, and there is not so much of a political movement. So I think that in the Ainu case, indigenous advocacy is something which the political movement is going to have to grow before the digital advocacy elements starts becoming apparent.
Would you say it'll be a long way for that to happen, for political advocacy to come in advocating for indigenous rights, for example?
That's it's completely unreadable when that's going to happen. There have been Ainu indigenous activists for 50 or 60 years, and there's at least one who was filming political gatherings of Ainu for the sake of political discussion, but I haven't heard of him putting his works onto the internet as of yet so far. So it's a question which is completely unanswerable.
And I heard you talk about indigenous futuristics. Can you give a brief definition of what it is, and if in any way how is it relate to the fourth cinema, fourth media?
Futurism or futuristics refers to how people refer to the future. And so one very common trope which you will hear in futurisms amongst mainstream society is about development and growth. Compared with this, indigenous peoples are often referred to in the past tense as people who belong to the past. And there are implications that indigenous peoples don't have a future as a group or as a community or as a nation. And indigenous futurisms seek to change this. They seek to imagine collective indigenous futures wherein indigenous worldviews and indigenous values are at the center of indigenous flourishing. I'm not well versed, but I know that in, for example, Australia or Canada, that there are indigenous movies. The one that I know from Canada is an animation about an indigenous person from the future who comes to various historical events and is able to relativize colonial histories as a result of this. And in Australia, they are making a documentary about how the knowledge of the elders can be passed on, transmitted to the future generations, and what the future is going to look like is completely unclear, but it's very important that that future is based upon the indigenous worldview and the indigenous values. And I think that slowly we're going to see people re-evaluating their own worldviews and their own values as these indigenous means of broadcasting become more and more popular.
So yeah, that's bring me to the final point I would like to ask you about is that when we talk about indigenous media, it's pre-assumed that it would be a so-called division among the mainstream and indigenous one who is supposedly marginalized. How do we connect the two together? How do we make indigenous media more visible into the mainstream media?
Right. Well, actually, I'm hoping that through this participation in IAFOR and the KAMC convention this time, that I'll be able to find people who will be able to help me answer that, how I can support the Ainu people to become more involved in mainstream media, or how we can help them to do so. But I've heard that Canada and New Zealand and Australia all have indigenous broadcasting corporations, and there is the news in indigenous languages broadcast by indigenous anchor people in all three of these countries. And Australia has gone even further in producing a Aboriginal science fiction television series, which sounded very fascinating to get people thinking about what are we as human beings. And so as another first step, I'm hoping to look into what the indigenous broadcasting corporations in Canada and New Zealand and Australia have done, and how the national governments in those three countries have supported the indigenous peoples in their media endeavors.
Right, lovely. Thank you so much for interviewing with me today. Thank you.
You're very welcome.